Humphrey Bogart. Humphrey Bogart was the ultimate Hollywood tough guy, gravel-voiced, trench-coat-clad, and always one step ahead of trouble. But behind that hard-boiled exterior was a sentimental side, one that revealed itself in his final wish. When he passed in January of 1957, his ashes were placed in a simple bronze urn. But it wasn't the urn itself that caught people's attention. It was the inscription. Etched into the metal were the words, "If you want anything, just whistle." A line spoken to his wife, Lauren Bacall, in their first film together, To Have and Have Not, back in 1944. It was more than just a famous quote. It was a message, a quiet, intimate reminder of their love, even beyond the grave. Despite his legendary status, Bogart's funeral was a surprisingly small and private affair. Held at Forest Lawn Memorial Park, it was attended by Hollywood's elite, Katharine Hepburn, Spencer Tracy, and, of course, Bacall, who placed a small whistle in his casket before it was sealed. But what many don't know is that Bogart's final resting place wasn't immediately set in stone. Due to cemetery regulations, his ashes were kept in a temporary location for years, delaying his burial far longer than expected. Some say it was a logistical issue. Others whisper that Bacall struggled to let go. Whatever the truth, one thing is certain. Bogart's final words, immortalized in bronze, ensure that his presence lingers, waiting for someone to whistle. James Dean. James Dean's grave in Fairmount, Indiana, isn't just a resting place. It's a magnet for mystery. Fans flock to pay tribute, but many leave with more than just memories. Some report their cars mysteriously breaking down after visiting, fueling whispers of a curse tied to his untimely passing in September of 1955. Could it be coincidence? Or is something more sinister at play? The eerie pattern has persisted for decades, with locals and visitors alike swapping chilling tales of post-visit misfortune. And then there's the tombstone itself, stolen not once, but multiple times. Cemetery officials have had to replace it repeatedly, as if even in death, Dean's rebellious spirit refuses to rest. The thefts remain unsolved, adding another layer of intrigue to the legend. Strangely, despite his status as an icon today, Dean's funeral was a quiet affair. Only a handful of Hollywood insiders attended, as his meteoric rise to fame truly took off after his tragic demise. His now famous quote, "Dream as if you'll live forever, live as if you'll die today," feels hauntingly prophetic. Whether you believe in the curse or not, one thing is certain. James Dean's final resting place is as enigmatic as the man himself. Peter Lorre. Peter Lorre's funeral was a scene straight out of one of his own unsettling films. The master of eerie, unsettling characters, famous for roles in M and Casablanca, had a send-off that felt more like a gathering of Hollywood's most sinister icons than a solemn farewell. Vincent Price, Boris Karloff, and other horror legends were in attendance, their presence turning the event into something of a gothic spectacle. But the real horror came when the funeral home briefly lost track of Lorre's body. For a tense period, rumors swirled that his remains had been stolen. Some even speculated it was the work of a deranged fan or a macabre prank. Though the body was eventually located, the bizarre mishap only added to the legend of Lorre's final days. Despite his fame, the man who once sent chills down spines was laid to rest in an unassuming grave at Hollywood Forever Cemetery, his final resting place markedly humble compared to the larger-than-life persona he crafted on screen. A fittingly eerie end for one of Hollywood's creepiest stars. Mickey Rooney. At one time, Mickey Rooney was one of Hollywood's highest-paid actors, a box office powerhouse whose name alone could sell out theaters. But when he passed away in April of 2014, the man who had once commanded millions was left with almost nothing. His entire estate was valued at just $18,000, a shocking contrast to the fortune he had amassed over his decades-long career. And even more heartbreaking, he couldn't even afford his own funeral. What followed was a bitter and public battle over where he should be buried. Family members were at odds, with some insisting he be laid to rest in a family plot, while others argued he deserved a place among Hollywood's elite. The dispute became so heated that it took outside donations to even make his burial possible. Ultimately, he was interred at Hollywood Forever Cemetery, a fitting resting place for a man who had spent his life in the spotlight. But the controversy surrounding his final days left a stain on his legacy, a stark reminder of how even the brightest stars can fade into financial ruin. Tyrone Power. Tyrone Power was a man who lived fast, loved deeply, and carried a chilling premonition about his own fate. The swashbuckling star of the 1940s often told friends he would die young, just like his father, who had suffered a fatal heart attack in his 40s. It was an eerie prophecy that tragically came true. In November of 1958, while filming the epic Solomon and Sheba in Spain, Power collapsed on set. He was rushed to the hospital, but the heart attack was fatal. He was only 44. Hollywood was left in shock. One of its brightest stars gone far too soon, just as he had predicted. His funeral became one of the largest the industry had ever seen, with luminaries like Marlene Dietrich and Cesar Romero paying their respects. Power was laid to rest at Hollywood Forever Cemetery beneath an elaborate tombstone featuring a theatrical mask, a fitting tribute to a man who had lived his life on the grandest stage. Even in death, his presence looms large, with fans still visiting his grave, drawn in by the haunting accuracy of his own prophecy. Some even claim to have sensed his presence near his final resting place, adding yet another layer of mystique to his tragic legacy. George Burns. George Burns always knew how to land a punchline, even in death. The cigar-smoking comedy legend had one final request: to be buried beside the love of his life, Gracie Allen. And in true Burns fashion, their shared tombstone at Forest Lawn Cemetery delivers one last laugh. It reads, "Together again," a nod to their beloved comedy act that had entertained audiences for decades. But Burns didn't just plan his final resting place, he orchestrated his own farewell tour. He famously joked that he had booked himself for a performance in Las Vegas on his 100th birthday, and he nearly made it. Burns lived to be exactly 100 years old, but passed away just weeks before his big show. Even in his final years, he never lost his sharp wit. "I look to the future, because that's where I'm going to spend the rest of my life," he once quipped. His funeral was anything but somber. Friends and fellow comedians filled the room with laughter, sharing his best jokes and remembering the man who had spent a century making the world smile. Burns had always believed that comedy was timeless, and in the end, he proved it. His humor lives on, etched in stone, and in the hearts of those who still chuckle at his legendary one-liners. Carole Lombard. It was supposed to be a triumphant return home. Carole Lombard, the dazzling queen of screwball comedy, had just completed a successful war bond tour raising millions for the troops. But on the night of January 16, 1942, her journey ended in tragedy. The TWA Flight 3, carrying Lombard, her mother, and 20 others, slammed into the side of Potosi Mountain in Nevada. The impact was so catastrophic that recovery teams could only identify Lombard by a fragment of jewelry and a scar on her foot. The once radiant star had been reduced to little more than ash and twisted metal. In a desperate attempt to preserve what remained, she was laid to rest in a lead-lined casket at Forest Lawn Cemetery. Her devastated husband, Clark Gable, was inconsolable. Hollywood's king had lost his queen. Overcome with grief, he threw himself into military service, joining the U.S. Army Air Forces as a way to numb the pain. But even years later, he never truly moved on. When Gable passed in 1960, his final request was honored. He was buried beside Lombard, ensuring that in death, they would be together once more. Yet, whispers still circulate about that fateful flight. Some claim Lombard had a premonition, a sense of foreboding before boarding. Others believe the crash was more than just an accident, pointing to wartime espionage and sabotage theories that refuse to die. Whatever the truth, one thing remains certain: Hollywood lost one of its brightest stars that night, and Clark Gable never recovered from the shadow it left behind. Jack Benny. Jack Benny was a man who built a career on impeccable timing, and even in death, his final act was perfectly orchestrated. Before passing, he made one last request, a romantic gesture that would outlive him. Every single day, his beloved wife, Mary Livingstone, was to receive a single red rose. It wasn't just a fleeting whim. Benny ensured it would happen by arranging it with a florist long before his final curtain call. And so, after he was gone, Mary continued to receive a rose, a silent message from beyond, a reminder that Jack's love was as enduring as his humor. She kept every single one, often holding them close and whispering, "Jack is still with me." The deliveries didn't stop until she too passed away nearly a decade later. Benny's funeral was as star-studded as one of his radio shows. Hollywood's greatest legends gathered to say goodbye, including Bob Hope and George Burns, both of whom had shared decades of laughter and friendship with him. Hope, known for his razor-sharp wit, was uncharacteristically somber, later saying that the world had lost one of its best comedic minds. But perhaps the biggest surprise of all was Benny's final resting place. Despite never being particularly religious, he was buried at Hillside Memorial Park, a Jewish cemetery in Los Angeles. Some speculated it was a nod to his heritage, others believed it was simply a practical choice. Either way, it was a fittingly unexpected ending for a man who had spent his life delivering punchlines no one saw coming. Gary Cooper. Gary Cooper had spent decades as Hollywood's ultimate cowboy, stoic, noble, larger than life. But when it came time for his final farewell, there were no grand processions, no golden caskets, no lavish Hollywood spectacle. Instead, the man who had once commanded the silver screen with effortless grace chose a quiet, deeply personal goodbye. In his final years, Cooper found solace in Catholicism, a decision that surprised many of his longtime friends. He requested a simple burial at Sacred Hearts Cemetery in New York, far from the glitz of Los Angeles. No elaborate mausoleum, no towering headstone, just a modest resting place, reflecting the humility he had embraced in life. When the day came, the guest list was intentionally small, a stark contrast to the star-studded funerals of his contemporaries. But one man stood among the mourners, his grief impossible to hide: John Wayne. The Duke, a man rarely seen without his signature tough exterior, delivered a eulogy that left the entire room silent. "He was the best of us all," Wayne said, his voice thick with emotion. It was a rare moment of vulnerability from a man who had built his own legend on strength and resilience. Hollywood had seen its fair share of extravagant goodbyes, but Cooper wanted no part of it. No public spectacle, no drawn-out tributes, just family, close friends, and a quiet farewell. It was a decision that spoke volumes about the man behind the legend. Even in death, Gary Cooper remained true to himself, rejecting the excesses of fame for something far more meaningful: peace. Barbara Stanwyck. Barbara Stanwyck spent decades commanding the screen with her fierce, no-nonsense presence, but in death, she chose to disappear entirely. No funeral, no memorial, no final gathering of Hollywood's elite. Just a simple request: I want no funeral, no memorial service, just scatter my ashes in Lone Pine. It was a decision that left Hollywood stunned. How could a star of her magnitude simply vanish without a trace? Lone Pine, California, held a special place in her heart. She had filmed many of her iconic westerns there, surrounded by the rugged landscapes that matched her indomitable spirit. But even in her chosen resting place, there is no plaque, no marker, nothing to indicate that one of Hollywood's most legendary actresses now rests there. And yet, fans still come. They gather in the quiet, wind-swept terrain, leaving flowers and tributes in places they believe she might have loved. Some say they feel her presence in the rustling leaves or the distant echo of a film reel spinning. Others speculate that she wanted to avoid the spectacle, the Hollywood machine that had shaped her life but never fully owned her. Even in death, Barbara Stanwyck remained an enigma, one final defiant act of control over her own legacy. Fred Astaire. Fred Astaire spent his life making the impossible look effortless. Every glide, every tap, every gravity-defying move, flawless. But when it came to his final bow, he wanted none of the spectacle. "I don't want any fuss or grandeur, just a simple private funeral," he insisted. And he meant it. No grand Hollywood tribute, no public mourning, just a quiet goodbye. His ashes were placed in an unassuming niche at Oakwood Memorial Park, a resting place far from the glitz of Hollywood. Yet, despite his insistence on privacy, fans couldn't let go. To this day, they visit, leaving tap shoes, dance programs, even handwritten notes, thanking him for the magic. Ironically, in trying to avoid a spectacle, Astaire ensured his legacy would never fade. His final resting place may be modest, but his impact? Immortal. Vivien Leigh. The world knew her as Scarlett O'Hara, the fiery Southern belle who refused to be forgotten. But when Vivien Leigh passed, there were no grand Hollywood tributes, no star-studded funeral. Instead, her final farewell was as private as the life she truly cherished. While millions mourned, only a handful of close friends gathered for a quiet memorial. Then, in a moment as poetic as any scene she had ever performed, her ashes were scattered over the lake at Tickeridge Mill, her beloved English retreat. It was a stark contrast to the dazzling, dramatic persona the world had adored. Some speculated that Hollywood had expected her to rest among its legends, perhaps in a grand mausoleum alongside other silver screen icons. But Leigh had made her wishes clear: no spotlight, no spectacle, just the still waters of her secluded haven carrying her away in silence. To this day, fans still visit the estate, longing for a glimpse of the place where the great Vivien Leigh chose to disappear forever. Charlie Chaplin. It was a crime so bizarre, it could have been a scene from one of his own films, except there was nothing funny about it. Just months after Charlie Chaplin was laid to rest in a quiet Swiss cemetery, his body vanished. Grave robbers had dug up the comedy legend's remains and now demanded a staggering $600,000 from his widow, Una. Authorities launched a frantic investigation, scouring the countryside for any trace of the stolen corpse. As the case unfolded, police intercepted calls from the criminals, tracing them to a pair of desperate men, an unemployed mechanic and a refugee, who had concocted the scheme in hopes of a massive payday. But their plan crumbled when officers caught them red-handed, leading to their arrest and the recovery of Chaplin's body. Shaken by the ordeal, Una refused to negotiate with the thieves, later recalling the nightmare it had caused her family. To ensure her husband would never be disturbed again, she had his remains reburied beneath a thick concrete slab at a modest cemetery in Vaud, Sweden. Today, Chaplin rests undisturbed, his final resting place now a fortress against those who might try to steal a piece of his legacy once more. Gloria Swanson. Gloria Swanson spent a lifetime draped in diamonds and basking in the glow of Hollywood's golden age. She was the ultimate starlet, the queen of silent films, a woman who once declared she wanted to be buried in a golden casket. But when the final curtain fell, her send-off was shockingly understated. No elaborate mausoleum, no grand Hollywood tribute, just a simple plaque in the Church of the Heavenly Rest in New York City. It's so unassuming that many fans have walked right past it, never realizing they were mere steps from the resting place of one of cinema's most dazzling icons. Her funeral was just as quiet. No grand procession, no sea of mourners, only a handful of close friends and family gathered to say goodbye. It was a stark contrast to the woman who once commanded the silver screen with the force of 1,000 spotlights. Some speculate that her modest burial was a personal choice, a reflection of her later years when she had moved away from the extravagance of Hollywood. Others believe it was simply a matter of finances, Despite her legendary status, Swanson's later years were not as glamorous as her prime. Whatever the reason, the contrast between her life and her final resting place is striking. This was the woman who embodied the very essence of old Hollywood, who famously declared in Sunset Boulevard, "I am big. It's the pictures that got small." And yet, in death, it was she who became small, reduced to a nearly invisible marker in a quiet church, far from the glitz and grandeur she once ruled. Was this her final act, a deliberate rejection of the excess that defined her era? Or was it simply the inevitable fate of even the brightest stars, fading quietly into the night? If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like and comment. Also, consider subscribing and hitting the notification bell to get notified of our newest videos. Thanks for watching.